So we thought we would do a little bit of a pre-concert discussion about the process behind this piece and sort of some of what's going on tonight, because this is quite a gargantuan undertaking that we're doing. It's not the longest concert, but it's a very dense one. And so we sort of wanted to give people as much of a tour and guide to it as possible. So Anne, I thought I would actually, the story of why we're doing this piece really starts with you.
All things do, said the soprano. Yeah, this is true. This is true. This is a little bit my own doing. So later on, when I'm panicking, I have only myself to thank. I came to hear, I was participating in an all-day music marathon called the Hot Air Festival that this gentleman helped to found.
Yeah, that was 15 years ago.
15 years ago at the conservatory. And I did play my set with my friend Carrie Smith, guitar player, and then I was like, I'm going to stick around and see what goes on at this crazy all-day new music festival. So I heard the, what's Giacomo's group called? Or Travis and
Living Earth Show.
Living Earth Show. I heard a wild set by Living Earth Show. They were playing actual syncs with like glass in them and electric guitars. And then I remember Monica Chu played some gorgeous Takamitsu piece. And then there was a really elaborate stage set change and all these chairs and all these stands, and something really big was going to happen. And I was like, okay, I'm not going home now, even though I'm tired, I'm going to stick around. But the program for Hot Air is very minimal. So it just lists piece names and ensembles. So it was like Grisey, Vortex Temporum, After Everything Ensemble. And I was like, well, I don't know what any of those things mean, but I'm going to stick around and see what's happening here. And I sat in my seat like stone still for the entire performance of this really massive, how long is the piece?
It clocks in at like 52 minutes, 53 minutes. It's huge.
It was like, I couldn't believe what I was hearing and feeling, and I was just loving it. And I could feel people around me kind of fidgeting and struggling a little bit because it was challenging, but
Makes sense.
Yeah, I was just mystified at it, and I was so impressed with this group I'd never heard of and all these young people doing the thing I love and going, the next generation is keeping the torch burning. So I knew you from Twitter.
Oddly.
And so after the concert, I DM'd him and said, wow, that was incredible. And then we subsequently had a long chat over Twitter DM about Grisey. I spent the weekend, I think it was like coming down with something, so I just spent the whole weekend like on my futon watching YouTube videos of Grisey. And then I found that there was this piece with voice, and I was like, oh, we gotta do this sometime. And so that was 2018?
Yeah, I think that sounds roughly right.
Yeah. And so we've been talking about this for 5 years.
Yeah. I want to, just as a couple humorous asides to that, the musicians that I used in that piece are many of the core musicians that you're going to see on stage today. Evan Kahn, our cellist, was in that piece. Jesse Nuko, the flutist, was in that piece. Sophie Hewitt, our bass clarinetist, was in that piece. Marion Yang, our violinist, was in that piece. So you'll see a lot of the familiar faces who played the last Grisey with this Grisey as well. I also want to add, out of odd happenstance, the Hot Air Music Festival is a festival that changes who the director is because it's always supposed to be a student director. And that Hot Air Music Festival happened to be directed by Mika Nakamura, who is one of our percussionists tonight as well. So fair bit of serendipity involved in all this as well. Yeah, so this piece is quite the undertaking.
It's a behemoth.
I
think it falls under the behemoth category.
That seems right to me.
I mean, look at the score. I mean, it's like when I open it, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please. If you need help, I can.
It's like almost as tall as me, So yeah, it's sorry, I know you have things in there.
No, it's okay.
But yeah, it's a major thing. It doesn't fit in any bags.
It's true, it really does.
Packing it to get here from Boston, I had to strategically put it in my checked baggage.
Yeah. So Grisey he's a French composer who invented a genre of music that people refer to as spectralism. But he abandoned it shortly after he invented it. He was quite happy to sort of take some of the principles of it that he had learned and move into something some people call it post-spectralism. It seems like whatever you invent a genre, the next thing you do is the post of the genre, but whatever. And this is actually the last piece that he finished writing. Was that me? No, not me, good. Okay, as long as it's not me. He worked on this piece for quite a while. It was a huge project for him. And he wanted to write this massive piece about sort of transitions in life, death being the big one. But then sort of he wanted to get out of that because Grisey is always interested in very large timescales. Vortex Temporum, the piece that Anne heard us do, is people describe it as like zooming on a galactic level through space. And this one is sort of similar. Every movement expands the time scale. The first movement is the story of an angel who is dying. The second movement, though, is about the death of civilizations, right? It's about an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus that we are trying to read, and most of it has been degraded and fallen away due to time. The third movement, the death of the voice, and the fourth movement, the death of humanity itself. But of course, the specter of the personal death, which is not something that Grisey necessarily wanted to include in this piece, has to be included in this piece because between his completion of the piece and the premiere of the piece, he passed away suddenly from an unexpected brain aneurysm. Quite heartbreaking. Yeah. 53, 54, something like that. Incredibly young.
Not right. Yeah.
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 Matthew was explaining to me too that he would typically go take his pieces through an editing process after the premiere, and so this piece didn't have that.
Yeah.
So we're sort of communing. I always think of, when I'm working with a score, I'm communing with the composer through that score. So we're kind of communing with Grisey in the very tail end of his working process.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. We find all sorts of weird moments in the score that you would never see in a typical finished score. We have notes that go outside the ranges of the instruments. We have techniques that are physically impossible or are not explained on how to do, and we have to sort of calculate how to do it ourselves, see what works for us, see how to portray this. And that's been part of the fun of the rehearsal process, too. But our working process has been particularly joyous. You want to talk a little bit?
Yes, we'll talk about space and time. So during the pandemic, my husband and I migrated many places, but we've now landed in Boston. So we are 3,000 miles away, but we started rehearsing or processing or meeting in January.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, like every other Monday, we'd get on Zoom and we'd work through pieces of, parts of the piece. It started with conversation, lots of conversation about the text and translation. Everything you'll hear is in French in this piece. It's 4 different text sources, so there's a lot of intrigue in terms of, it's not like when you're doing a piece with a single text source, so you can kind of get deep into like Baudelaire or Rimbaud, or here's a point of view and I'm just going to stay with it. This changes point of view quite dramatically from movement to movement, so there was a lot to unpack there. French is not Matthew's first language, but it was the language I studied.
Third, seventh. I don't speak anything, so.
I studied it quite a lot in school, and so there was some, what really does this word mean? We have the translation that's been supplied, like in the CD liner notes, but what does this word mean for us? So we did a lot of translating together. We talked about the score. He understands Grisey's language, the way he notates things, so he was able to help me understand the gestural quality, what Grisey's intentions are when he marks dynamics that are, imperceptible. Well, how do I voice that? That was so helpful. And then at a certain point, we actually started working musically, but there was a long process of just getting to know the piece together and getting to know our intention for interpretation, which is such a luxury
Yeah,
to
it's
have that
been a
kind
real
of
pleasure.
time.
It's not uncommon for musicians to be in a situation where, you get the music and then you have a week to learn it and then a week to rehearse it and then you perform it and you move on to the next thing. But this is a piece that is a project that both of us have felt really deeply about. And, we started talking about it 5 years ago, as you're saying, but then we sort of committed to it, I would say, over this last summer.
Yeah, and when I was here, I think in November or October of last year, we sat down at a cafe outside and paged through the score and kind of
A
said,
lot of people
"Wow,
were
what's
like,
going on
"What are
here?"
you looking at? This massive thing." What is-"
Exactly. We were a spectacle. And yeah, I mean, as a vocalist, I love the experience of working with conductors and with large ensembles, but it is an oddly isolating experience for how communal or the final collaboration is. The learning process can be very isolated because I don't get to kind of call up the conductor and say, what do you think this means? Or, oh, is this a transposing instrument that I'm getting my note from? Or, there isn't usually this amount of back and forth. And also kind of room for me to suggest interpretations or to suggest alternative translations. There's just such an openness in our exchange that's really rare. As a soloist, you kind of come in a couple rehearsals, you do all your work alone, and then you come in for a couple rehearsals and go, okay, how does the person with the stick want this to go? And how do I kind of graft that together with what I thought it was going to go like? And it's this sort of mashing together of points of view, and hopefully you agree or you can adjust, because in the end, the person with the stick is usually the one who gets to tell everybody what to do. Yeah. And so, I mean, this has just been utterly luxurious.
It really has. It's been, in essence, what we have done is more so than usual. We have created our interpretation, right? Something that is 100% both of us.
Truly.
And feels like both.
And then the way, honestly, I'm going to just wax a little bit here, but the way that Matthew works with the ensemble is also, it's just this is such a consortium, a collaborative environment. It's really a family vibe. And in the new music world, this is not often the case. I mean, oftentimes we can barely look up out of our scores because everyone's just so busy trying to interpret the markings that they've been allotted, and you might not even get to know the name of the person sitting next to you, and just the environment or the vibe that he sets up in this ensemble is so collegial. It's so open. I feel like everyone in the room has space to voice their needs, their concerns, their ideas. It's just absolutely been lovely.
It's really good to hear. I'm glad to hear that.
It's such a good tone.
Good, I'm glad.
And it's not common. I mean, it really isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I do want to open up the floor to questions for people who might have questions about anything to do with this concert, this show, with our working process, and all that good stuff. If you raise your hand, I'll do something. But, oh, yes, please.
You're talking about Grisey, and I do not know his work, and I'm almost wishing that we could talk to you afterwards after we've heard it, because I'm so curious. So.
I will probably be here. There's a lot of breakdown that we're going to do, and I'll probably be supervising that a little bit. So if you can stomach an interruption or two, then happily I will do so. Grisey's a very interesting composer from the latter half of the 20th century. He passed away in I can check the score. 98. There you go. Thank you. Couldn't remember. So he's a French composer who became very interested in this idea of spectralism. Spectralism was really an invention of the 70s based on the harmonic series. There's sort of a realization that all harmonies that we typically deal with are rooted in the harmonic series, our typical Western harmony 1-4-5-1. This is all the harmonic series, blah, blah, blah. And they realized that the timbre of instruments as well is actually a sound that is vibrating on multiple frequencies at the same time. This is something that we knew beforehand, but an invention of a device called a spectrometer allowed them to visualize this. And he was curious what would happen, basically, and I'm going to simplify things a little bit here, but basically, if I have a double bass playing its low E string as loud as it can, and I record it with a spectrometer, then I'm going to see all these various higher vibrations that are going on. What happens if I double those higher vibrations with flutes, piccolos, trombones, whatever, other things? And the answer is that you get like a very, very brilliant, bright sound that is that sounds very resonant and tonal, even though you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be. And that was sort of the birth of what spectralism is. That's, again, a broad simplification, and any spectralist expert here is going to chew me out for blah, blah, whatever. But that's the basic premise. And so that's where he came from. And as he developed his harmonic language, he decided that he could start using some of those techniques, but manipulating them to match a more linear harmonic progression, a more contrapuntal one as well. So he can create sort of these multiple lines that are occurring both physically from the instruments, what they're playing, but also harmonic lines that are actually just the results of the instruments that are not really being played. You imagine notes in your head that are part of the texture. He's intending you to imagine that note that you're imagining, which is a very weird thing for him to do, but it kind of works.
Is it the overtones?
Yes, it's the overtone series, exactly. It doesn't line up exactly with, it is part of the overtone series, but because he's analyzing the sounds with a spectrometer, you don't necessarily always get the same ones on every instrument. Different instruments are going to emphasize different overtones in the overtone series. So again, it's not that different from our old school Western harmony, but it is higher on the spectrum than that, and it's a little weird, and the results are cool.
Do you want to introduce the idea of the quarter tone system? Because that plays a pretty big role in this piece.
Sure.
Is that always part of spectralist?
It ends up being a result of it. So, okay.
Sorry, this
No,
is
no,
like
it's
me
fair.
now wanting to understand.
Yeah.
Matthew, tell us about.
That wasn't fair enough. Yeah, so the overtone series, okay. Let's do it. No, we'll just do it. Okay, so here's the principle. For those of you who are unaware of this, anytime any sound is heard, it is vibrating not just on the level that it is vibrating on, but it's vibrating on multiple frequencies, many of them above them. They're hard to hear. Sometimes you can hear them. If you're trained, you can start to hear them more and more and more, but they're there, right? And the lowest ones are very, very, very tonal and resonant. They're things that we can hear pretty easy. They're the big intervals of octaves and fifths and major thirds. Eventually, though, that overtone series, those frequencies, stop meshing quite so well with sort of what we think of as a normal piano scale, the standard chromatic scale. They start not quite meshing and being slightly out of tune with that, but they actually sound more in tune in some contexts. And the result of that is that it's a very, very cool sound to use. And Grisey he utilized a notation system to get some of the players to actually play the notes in between the notes that are part of the overtone series rather than normal, typical piano notes. So that's a little bit about that. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so you'll hear,
Yeah.
what the adjustment has been for me, first working on my own, was finding the note between F sharp and G flat, because there's something in there. There's another note in there. And then it was continuing to find those notes in my own instrument, while around me I'm hearing a whole bunch of other timbres, other instrumental timbres, playing also notes that are in between the notes. And some of the instruments are in fact tuned a quarter tone in one direction or the other. So everything they play is going to be a note in between the note, unless they're adjusting to be the note that's not between the note. So in any case, it's been a real sound world adjustment for me, both internally and externally, to prepare this piece and to rehearse this piece. I'm very curious what the experience. You know, it's like you get so deep into a piece that you can't remember what the first time felt like. It's a little like marriage. It's like, I know I'm here for a lot of reasons, but they're not necessarily the same as the ones that I started out being here for. So I'm just so interested I do kind of wish we were doing this again after the concert to just get a sense of like, what was that experience like? You know, I can imagine some people maybe spend time listening to a piece like this, trying to push it into, you know, normal tuning, or, you know, why does it sound out of tune? But I think hopefully I think it's constructed in such a way that it over time invites you into its slippery sound world. So I hope that's the experience for everybody listening.
Absolutely. Any other questions? That was a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Could you talk a little about the layout of the program, Matthew?
Sure, absolutely. So you have two pieces of paper if you've got a program in front of you. One of them is a single piece of paper. It just lists all of the pieces in the order that we're doing them. It's a little confusing because one of the pieces that we're doing is a Bach cantata, sort of adapted and changed and manipulated in weird and unusual ways. And it is sporadic throughout the program, so it's going to go in between almost every other piece. So that'll sort of always be your baseline. You'll hear Bach, and then you'll hear something very different, and then you'll hear Bach, and then you'll hear something else totally different, and then you'll hear Bach, and then you'll hear something even weirder, and then you'll hear Bach again. So that's that. The other piece of paper that you have is something that I sort of added on a lark. It's called it's called a listening guide. Really, there is a scholar and a teacher who I love. His name is Robert Greenberg. He's a local person, and he makes listening guides to accompany all sorts of works as he's teaching his lectures, and I love them. I found them to be so useful. I use them when I'm teaching. I use them for myself just for fun. I've brought them to symphony concerts and followed the listening guide rather than the score sometimes. And I sort of did my own version of that for the concert. So you can see it has just some notes, things that you might hear in each of the pieces. It has some questions that you might think to ponder as you go through the concert as well. And it's really just there to aid and help you. And you know, if you can't see it because the lights are off, which very well may be the case, I didn't consider that, but you have it afterwards to reflect upon what you have heard, or to anticipate what you have heard, and all that. That answer your question? Beautiful. Any other question?
And it's continuous. Like, so when the concert starts, sound will continue all the way to the end. And I say this for two reasons. One, because I think it's really cool. I love long form listening, and I think it just gives you a chance you don't have to wonder about, is it time to clap? Because it's not. And you'll know, it's the end. The end is when it's time to clap. But it's also important to use the restroom before we start. This is always my thought and priority. You know, no intermission. Okay. And there's also no break between the things. So like, yeah, get it done.
Wise.
Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone? Well, Anne, can you talk about, just for me, for the sake of it, well, if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand, but if you can, for just a second, can you talk about some of what's the most, difficult thing that we had to do in preparation for this, and how did that feel, and how did you go about accomplishing that?
Well, my approach with this piece has been informed by the experience of not being able to sing with anyone for quite some time. So typically when I open a score like this one that's kind of riddled with challenges, I will attack it in a way there's a lot of analysis involved in how I learn something like this, but I will also kind of hack at it. Usually there's a short amount of time that I'm trying to hack at something and tackle it. And I'm usually, this is in the before times, I'm usually doing multiple things at once. So I've got some Mozart going around in my head, and then I'm doing something that was written last week. And then maybe I'm got a church job and I'm singing some Thomas Tallis in the morning. So compartmentalizing and going at things with a really kind of, forceful kind of energy my life is so different now. I have so much time. I have so much silence. I have so much isolation. And I have so much reverence for this experience that my goal when I was working with this score was to work on it when I was in a good mood to begin with, and only work on it so long as I stayed in a good mood. If I started to get frustrated or whatever, I put it away, I stepped away. I started in December. I knew I had plenty of time. I tried not to stress myself out about it. I knew I had this incredible resource that I could just text and say, I'm confused about this. But I did decide at the very beginning that I was going to start with what I thought were the hardest parts. I paged through the whole thing and I was like, oh, that's going to be really hard. I'm just going to start with that. I'm not going to let it be a fearful thing. I'm not going to put it off. I'm just going to go right into that. And subsequently, the sort of on paper trickiest parts of this piece are the most settled, which is really, really comforting. What I realized later on is like none of it's easy. So the things that I was like, oh, that'll be easy. No, it's not. And so I'm like scrambling to work on the easy parts. But there, I have techniques that I use to deal with very disjunct melodies, which you'll hear a lot of those disjunct, the opposite of conjunct. So conjunct would be things in a scale. Disjunct is when you have notes following each other that are not at all next to each other. And I have some techniques that I use to learn patterns like that. I do a lot of work with the metronome. I love the metronome dearly. But really the mood, the sort of decision that I've made, and I've made this, I think, for the rest of my life, and I'm really emphasizing this with my students, is the temporal quality of this art form, that it only happens while it's happening, and that's your chance to experience it. So if you're freaking out, or if you're stressing about the next measure, you're not really experiencing it, and when it's over, it's over. And it can be over for a long time, suddenly, and we don't know when that might happen again. So I'm really, really aiming for presence, for grace for myself, for pleasure. I love to derive some pleasure from each of these physical experiences that I'm going to have, for communication, for interaction. So I think my decision to learn this piece in a good mood hopefully has set me up for a pleasurable performance.
That's a perfect segue for me personally. I want to talk just for a second about sort of the theme of this concert. This is something that I started thinking about a couple years ago. I realized that I was putting on a lot of concerts that were very good concerts. I'm very happy with them. But I started realizing that they were feeling to me like a hodgepodge of pieces that weren't really linked. It was this random piece that I liked, and that random piece that I liked, and that random piece that I liked. And I wanted to start putting together pieces and programs that were unified around some sort of theme, so that I could feel like we were making a statement over the course of the concert. And for me personally, I have found that the way that this works best for me is if I focus not on something that I'm trying to state about the world, but rather a question that I'm trying to explore instead. And so for this concert, we really did start with the Grisey, but the first thought that came to me as I was listening to and studying this piece is a question: why is it that change is sometimes so incredibly hard? And the Grisey is really about that on a very large scale. We have, again, the second one is about ancient Egypt, and we're looking at the loss of ancient Egypt's culture. The third movement is about the loss of the human voice, and the fourth about humanity. And I tried to incorporate that into the other pieces that I picked to put on the concert as well. The Bach cantata that we're doing is a cantata that is essentially a conversation between two characters, hope and fear. Hope representing everything's going to be all right, and fear talking about anxiety. It is anxiety about death for fear in this case, but it really, what spoke to me most was the anxiety about some sort of existence change, state of existence change. The Du Yun that Jesse Nuko is going to be playing is a very, very deeply personal piece about grief and how grief is a state that you can be in and how you try to change out of that state but can't. It's something that stays with you sometimes and wells up inside of you, whether you want it to or not. When you think you're at your most fine, sometimes it just sneaks back up and hits you again. And then, of course, sort of our brightest piece on the concert in some ways is a beautiful piece by Ambrose Akinmusire, which he wrote. He's a jazz trumpet player, and he wrote it in 2013. And it's a piece called The Beauty of Dissolving Portraits. And it was his attempt to sort of reconcile some of the difficulties that he felt with having idols, political idols, that he truly admired, and then finding out that they were problematic people, for the word of the time, and how he thought about that. And for him, it was about changing our framing about thinking about them, how we think about them, and turning it from being like, this is something that mars them, and changing it into something that humanizes them. Their act of bravery or courage or accomplishment as they pushed back against oppression or whatever was a good thing. Their failings humanize them and allow us to empathize with them and sympathize with them and kind of make them less off in the distance and something that's more a part of us. And so this idea of change and the difficulty of change was just like a very natural element to bring into this. And I just thought I'd talk about that a little bit. And also a little bit about loss.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's like when we started talking about doing this piece in 2018, we had no concept of how pertinent it was going to become. It's this piece about, witnessing the end of things in different ways, witnessing the death of an angel, something that's supposed to be eternal, and really deeply observing the type of death that an angel dies. It's just, there's a really intent witnessing energy in that first movement of the Grisey. The second movement is witnessing through the act of translation, of transcribing this language on the outside of a sarcophagus that somebody clearly thought was really important that it be preserved. They carved it into stone, this epitaph, and now most of it is gone, and there's just snatches of what this message was supposed to be. So we see the loss of important things that we wanted to say, that we wanted to be remembered, and they can't be because it's been washed away. The loss of the voice, the loss of the ability to express oneself, very personally relevant for me and any other singer or wind player in the room that just had to go hide for 18 months and still experiences anxiety every time we do our thing, because the last thing we want to do is make somebody ill with our art. And finally, this witnessing of the end of the world, the storm, the flood episode that happens in so much of our epic literature, that we together are going to witness the destruction of the earth, but there is something beautifully hopeful in that because we are witnessing it. We are here to see it, and we're here afterwards to see what comes after. So that means we're still here. There's this sort of inherent hope built into the piece, even though it's about things being demolished, things being taken away, things being lost.
It was you who pointed out that one of the important words in the Gilgamesh, at the end of the world, there is clay. And clay in so many different cultures is the representation of the building block of life or creativity itself.
Yeah,
so
fertility.
even fertility, right? Even after everything is gone, there is still hope.
Yeah, everything is reduced to clay, which what do you do with clay? You get it wet, mash it up, make something new. So anyhow, it's a bummer that we couldn't do this in 2019 or 2020 or 2021, but it's really fitting, I think, that we are able to do it now. And I think Matthew's put a really lovely dedication into the program. Certainly holding in my own heart people who have lost or we have lost. And I think that's something fair to invite everyone here to bring in to the space, is just to hold the things that we've lost, the people we've lost, the people who've experienced loss, and witness, just bear witness to that.
Well, that's beautiful.
Well, thank you.
We do have room for one more question if anyone has something. And if not, then, oh, yes.
I was just wondering, how tight is the score? You're talking about temporalness. Is there some sort of a impromptu part, or what you feel at each performance? It's just the way the sound kind of comes off different.
There's a question, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but you're interested in how tight the performance is or how free?
The score is the musicians following it, or is there some room for certain interpretation?
Yeah, so the question is how restrictive versus interpretive is the score? How much room do we have to be free as performers?
The Grisey is, I would say, extremely prescriptive. Like it is, everything is very decided. It's a very, it's got a lot of architecture. It's not what I would call an aleatoric piece.
No. But I would say there's a weird, okay, this is just how I feel. Take this with a grain of salt, definitely. But there's a weird element of notated music that when it is well notated, then the more notation, to a degree, the more freedom we have in interpreting it, right? If there's a note on a page, then I can just play a note. I don't know how to play it. But the more instruction you give me how to play that note, the more I have an idea about the emotion and the physicality and the embodiment that that note is supposed to be. So if I have a note that is not just a note, but now has a crescendo from nothing, right? So it's supposed to start from nothing and turn into a note. Then I actually have even more ways that I can play that than I can play just a normal note on a page, right? I have a lot of ways of thinking about how I want to grow. What does that growth feel like? How is that growth supposed to mean something in the context of this piece? How does that growth feel with the person next to me? How's the conductor going to feel about it? So I frequently find that if it's the right notation, then it gives me enough information to be more free, even though it is the score is dense and there's a lot of notes there and I've got to get them all right, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think it's the difference between instructions that are good and instructions that aren't. You can have really detailed instructions that do not result in the bookcase looking and functioning like a bookcase. And you're like, well, these are not helpful. I'm just going to build this bookcase without the instructions. These instructions do result in a really beautiful bookcase that you're like, wow, this is so great. I put the Allen wrench here and I add this and hey, bookcase. And it works. So there's something, you can kind of sit down into that and just relax and know that you're following a really beautiful map. I think both the Du Yun and the Akinmuzira piece involve a certain extent of improvisation. So it's not as though that spirit isn't present here.
Yeah, the solo flute piece by Du Yun and Empty Garlic that Jesse Nuko is playing has several pages of improvisation and hilariously, I think 2 pages that are both incredibly difficult and incredibly strictly notated that at the bottom, the original performer said, just improvise this. There's that. And then the Ambrose Akinmuzira that we're doing, Ambrose originally improvised it. He gave some instructions, loose instructions to a group of friends who were in the recording studio with him, and he just improvised a solo trumpet line on top. Our trumpet player, Cortez Montalvo, is playing sort of a hybrid between the original the original improvisation. So he's actually playing a strict rendition of someone else's totally free improvisation, but then he's adding some of his own flourishes on top of that as well to bring that element of freedom in.
Great question.
Excellent question. I have no idea what time it is. I don't know why I said I have time for one.
One more question.
Go for it.
Was this whole program inspired by the Grisey?
The seed was the Grisey.
Okay, that's all.
I don't know if I would say inspired by, mostly because I don't want to, but anchored by, yeah, that seems right. And I think that's all we have time for. So we're going to call it there, and I will see you guys on the other side of this.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Good stuff.
A little over.